After Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus died, East German authorities stepped into his quiet Dresden villa and were reportedly stunned by what awaited them. Locked rooms concealed private documents, covert correspondence, and evidence of a life torn between allegiance and defiance. The discovery was swiftly buried. Files classified, reports erased, answers locked away in archives, still sealed. Years later, historians remain haunted by the question of what was truly found inside the house on Preussstrasse Ten. Was it a long-hidden confession? Or a revelation potent enough to reshape the legacy of one of World War II's most controversial commanders? The field marshal who refused to die on command. Anyone even loosely connected to Adolf Hitler has a way of lingering in history long after their bones are dust. Their decisions keep academics and historians arguing with one another across decades, splitting opinion, inviting judgment. And right in the middle of this unresolved debate stands Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, a man remembered less for what he did than for what he refused to do. The winter of 1943 was not merely cold, it was punitive. Across the ruins of Stalingrad, snow fell like ash, settling over streets that no longer functioned as streets. Only frozen trenches filled with debris, bodies, and broken weapons. Tanks lay half-buried, their steel hulls cracked open like carcasses abandoned by scavengers. In cellars and collapsed basements, German soldiers clutched rifles that barely worked, and letters from home they would never send. Their breath rose in thin white clouds that hovered briefly before vanishing into the dead air. The city had stopped being a place. It had become a graveyard. Of men, of pride, of the German Sixth Army. At the center of that frozen hell stood a man whose entire career had been built on control. Friedrich Paulus was never a battlefield brawler. He wasn't Rommel, charging across deserts, or Guderian racing tanks through enemy lines. Paulus was a planner, a staff officer, a perfectionist who trusted clean maps more than muddy boots. Before Stalingrad, his reports were immaculate, precise handwriting, tidy margins, movements calculated like geometry problems. War, to Paulus, followed rules, and Stalingrad had none. By late 1942, the Sixth Army was trapped. Operation Uranus, a Soviet pincer movement executed with brutal precision, snapped shut around Paulus's forces like a steel jaw. Within days, nearly 300,000 Axis troops were encircled. Supply lines vanished, communications broke down, temperatures plunged below minus 30 degrees Celsius. What followed wasn't a battle, it was slow erasure. Hitler, far away in his wolf's lair, refused every request to withdraw. Stalingrad must be held, he insisted, to the last man and the last bullet. Paulus obeyed at first, because that's what disciplined officers did. He believed in duty, in hierarchy, in order. But discipline erodes when hunger sets in. Inside what soldiers grimly called the cauldron, structure dissolved into desperation. Horses were eaten, then the dogs soon met the same fate. Even the wallpaper paste was boiled for its starch. Men froze in trenches clutching rifles they could no longer fire. Letters were written not to be mailed, but to preserve some final proof of humanity. And still the orders came, asking them to hold the city. From a distance it sounds absurd, almost unreal. But to the men dying in that snow, it was madness stamped with authority. Then came January 30, 1943, Hitler's birthday. And with it, a message to Paulus that includes a promotion. Hitler made him field marshal. It wasn't a reward, it was a warning. No German or Prussian field marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was unmistakable: die for me. But Paulus didn't. He was starving, exhausted, and surrounded by tens of thousands of dying men. Whatever myth of German invincibility had once existed had frozen solid in the ruins. Suicide to Paulus wasn't courage, it was vanity. As a devout Catholic, he considered it a sin, and perhaps somewhere beneath the frost and fatigue, he understood that dying for Hitler would redeem nothing. So Friedrich Paulus did the unthinkable. He surrendered. When the news reached Berlin, the response was volcanic. Hitler raged. Paulus was branded a coward. Propaganda ministries quietly erased his name. His portrait vanished from offices. Officially, he was better off dead. Germany needed martyrs, not survivors. But Paulus wasn't dead. He was cold, broken, and very much alive, sitting in Soviet custody, staring at the ruins of everything he had commanded. The Soviets didn't parade him through the streets, they studied him. Here was Hitler's Field Marshal, captured alive, intact, humiliated. Not just a military prize, but a psychological one. They treated him like a puzzle. Paulus was moved to a secluded compound. No beatings, no cameras, no show trials. Just questions. Quiet, patient, relentless. Soviet interrogators understood something important. Force wasn't necessary. Time would do the work. For months, Paulus refused to cooperate. He wouldn't denounce Hitler, wouldn't condemn Germany. Isolation, however, is corrosive. Slowly, information was fed to him, carefully selected. News of his soldiers dying in captivity. Accounts of atrocities he'd never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. Then came the final blow. Hitler had publicly declared him a disgrace, stripped of honor, stripped of memory. Something broke. The man who had lived by loyalty realized he had been discarded without hesitation. The system he had obeyed to the end had erased him the moment he disobeyed once. That was when Paulus stopped resisting. To the Soviets, he became a weapon, not of steel but of symbolism, a defeated field marshal willing to speak. To Germans, he became a traitor. To himself, perhaps, he was simply tired of obedience that led only to death. He began cooperating, appearing on Soviet radio, calling on German soldiers to surrender. Later at Nuremberg, he testified against the Nazi leadership, calm, precise, devastating. And yet, even then, Paulus remained an enigma. Was his conversion genuine, or was it survival dressed up as conscience? Some former comrades insisted he'd been reprogrammed. Others whispered he was acting, biding his time. The truth probably sat somewhere in between, part awakening, part exhaustion, part necessity. After years in Soviet custody, history shifted again. Stalin died in 1953. The Cold War recalibrated itself. The Soviets decided to release their most famous captive, but not to the West, where Paulus might reclaim control of his story. Instead, they sent him eastward again to Dresden, a peaceful retirement for a rehabilitated man. To anyone familiar with East German reality, it was something else entirely, a controlled environment, or as one former Stasi agent later put it, a comfortable cell with curtains. The villa had history, seized after the war, then repurposed and wired. Paulus lived there alone, surrounded not by comrades but by microphones. His wife remained in West Germany. Letters between them were censored or disappeared entirely. He never saw her again. In those final years, Paulus lived quietly, walking by the river, reading, writing, thinking. No longer a soldier, no longer fully anything. A man who had outlived every oath he'd ever sworn. On February 1, 1957, Friedrich Paulus died in that villa. East German newspapers offered brief, sanitized farewells. The world had already buried him once, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. And yet 3 years earlier, the doors of the Nuremberg courtroom had opened, and there he stood. Not as a martyr, not as a hero, but something far more unsettling. From field marshal to witness, how Stalingrad followed Paulus into captivity. When the doors of the Nuremberg courtroom opened in February 1946, the room seemed to hold its breath. The man who stepped inside wasn't supposed to exist anymore. At least, that's how many people remembered it. Friedrich Paulus, the architect of Stalingrad, the field marshal who vanished into snow, hunger, and surrender, had long since been filed away as a ghost of the Eastern Front. Yet there he was, alive, thin, and unmistakable. No uniform, no medals, just a simple gray suit hanging off a frame that looked carved from exhaustion. The British press gave him a nickname almost instantly, the Ghost of Stalingrad. American journalists stared. German officers sitting in the dock avoided his eyes. Some looked down, others looked away entirely, because the man entering the courtroom was not returning as one of them. Herr Feldmarschall had come back, changed, detached, and carrying something far heavier than rank. His capture, years earlier, had been anything but dramatic. There were no photographs of surrender, no raised hands, no cinematic standoff. The Soviets simply escorted him out of the freezing basement of a Stalingrad department store, where his headquarters had collapsed into rubble. One moment he was issuing impossible orders, the next, he was gone. And the Red Army knew exactly what it had seized. Not just a field marshal, but the Field Marshal. The first in German history ever taken alive. A symbol too valuable to waste in a camp. So Paulus wasn't thrown behind barbed wire. Instead, he was driven far east, away from the front, to a guarded compound where he was treated with an odd blend of courtesy and calculation. He was a specimen. The Soviets called him the Trophy General. At first, Paulus refused to play along. He answered no questions about Hitler, offered no analysis of German strategy. He spent his days writing notes and redrawing battle maps, not for his captors, but for himself. Order was his refuge. Routine was his armor. As long as he could structure his hours, he could keep the chaos outside. When Soviet officers handed him newspapers detailing Nazi atrocities, he pushed them aside. When they offered radio broadcasts condemning Hitler, he refused to listen. He told himself this was propaganda. That truth, real truth, belonged to soldiers, not victors. The Soviets didn't argue, they waited. Isolation does things to a man, especially a disciplined one. Then the information began to arrive, slowly, deliberately. Reports of German soldiers dying in Soviet captivity, letters from home that never reached their recipients. News of Hitler's fury at the surrender.
Adolf Hitler is believed to be dead. Our reporter Jonathan has more.
That's right. Hitler was the leader of the Nazi Party and called for the annihilation of the Jewish race.
No, I think that's a bit disrespectful, Jonathan. I think we shouldn't be saying nasty things about a man who's just passed away.
One day, almost casually, an officer informed Paulus that Hitler had stripped him of rank and honor, calling him a disgrace to Germany. Paulus didn't react, but that night he didn't sleep. That was the first crack. Later he was moved again, this time to a villa outside Moscow. The atmosphere changed. Guards softened. Soldiers were replaced by visitors. Historians, theologians, German communists who had fled the Nazis long before the war. They didn't interrogate him. They debated him. They talked about conscience, about obedience, about responsibility. They didn't frame Hitler as Germany's savior. They called him what Paulus had never allowed himself to say aloud, its destroyer. And Paulus, still deeply Catholic, found their arguments unsettlingly precise. This wasn't just an argument anymore. It was logic, the kind that dismantles belief brick by brick. The Soviets never demanded a confession. They offered reasoning instead. It was psychological chess, and Paulus, the old strategist, realized too late that he was playing on their board. The turning point came in July 1944. When Paulus learned of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler, an effort involving officers he knew personally, something shifted. The executions that followed horrified him. When told that Klaus von Stauffenberg and others had been hanged as traitors, Paulus reportedly muttered, "They were soldiers. They acted with conscience." From that moment on, the silence ended. By late 1944, a new voice began appearing on Soviet radio. Calm, precise, and unmistakably German. "This is Friedrich Paulus," it announced, calling on the soldiers of Germany to end this meaningless war. To Berlin, it was treason. To Moscow, it was gold. The man who had led 300,000 Germans into Stalingrad now urged them to lay down their arms. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-backed organization of captured officers and exiles condemning Nazism. Was it real? Historians still argue. Some believe Paulus experienced a genuine moral awakening after grasping the scale of Hitler's crimes. Others see a colder calculation, survival, disguised as conviction, a man choosing the side with food, warmth, and power. Even the Soviets weren't entirely certain. But certainty wasn't required. A symbol was, and Paulus fit perfectly. That symbol walked into Nuremberg 3 years later. On February 11, 1946, Paulus took the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent. This was the commander of Stalingrad, now testifying for the prosecution against his former comrades. He spoke quietly and carefully. He described Hitler's interference in military operations, the impossible orders from Berlin. When asked about Hermann Göring's promise to supply the Sixth Army by air, Paulus allowed himself a bitter half-smile. "It was fantasy," he said. "We were promised an ocean, and we received a puddle." There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion. He spoke like a man performing an autopsy, not on an army but on a nation. To the Allies, his testimony was validation they needed. To many surviving Wehrmacht officers, it was an unforgivable betrayal. When the session ended, Paulus left quietly. Reporters shouted questions. He offered only one sentence: "I served a criminal regime. I bear my part of the guilt." Then he vanished again. Paulus was not released after Nuremberg. The Soviets returned him to a guarded residence near Moscow. Officially, he was now a consultant on military history. In reality, he remained a prisoner, just one with privileges. He had a cook, a doctor, and an adjutant. He even spent a short vacation in Crimea, which some Soviet officers joked was a reward for services rendered to socialism. But comfort didn't cure loneliness. His wife, living in West Germany, was unreachable. Letters were censored. Most never arrived. He often wrote the same line again and again: "Tell her I am well." He wasn't. He filled his days writing military analyses for Soviet officers, reviewing old battle reports, dissecting campaigns down to the smallest logistical failure. It was as if he believed understanding Stalingrad completely might somehow redeem it or himself. In the quiet Moscow evenings, Paulus came to a bleak realization. He no longer belonged anywhere. Germany viewed him as a traitor. The Soviets saw him as a useful artifact. He had surrendered his army, his loyalty, and finally his silence, but gained no home in return. When Stalin died, everything shifted again. The new Soviet leadership wanted to appear more humane, more diplomatic. Part of that effort involved releasing a handful of high-profile German prisoners. Paulus's name was on the list, but freedom came with conditions. They would not send him west. Not yet. Instead, they placed him somewhere safer, quieter, and more controlled. A villa with a river, a different kind of captivity, one where the war never quite let him go. Object Terrace, the house that listened. When Friedrich Paulus arrived in Dresden in 1953, the city still looked like a scar that refused to heal. Rubble lined the streets. Facades stood hollow, like stage sets abandoned after a catastrophe. Even years after the firebombing, the air seemed to remember the heat, the ash, the screams, the night Dresden burned and never quite stopped smoldering. Florence on the Elbe was rebuilding, yes, but unevenly. Soviet-style apartment blocks rose beside shattered Baroque shells, as if the future were being stacked directly on top of the past without bothering to clear the wreckage first. Into this half-reborn city stepped Friedrich Paulus, former Field Marshal of the German Sixth Army, freshly released from Soviet captivity and newly repackaged by the East German state. And the government handed him what looked, at first glance, like generosity: a villa on Preussstrasse Ten, perched above the Elbe in the leafy district of Loschwitz. To the public, it was a reward, proof of redemption. The once loyal servant of Hitler, now reborn as an anti-fascist voice for peace. To anyone who understood how the system worked, it was something else entirely. The house wasn't a home, it was a cage, with better furniture. Inside intelligence circles, the villa had a name: Object Terrace. It sounded boring, harmless, and almost polite. In reality, it was a listening post disguised as hospitality. Wires threaded through the walls, microphones hid inside lamps and sockets. Even the gardener, cheerful, punctual, and strangely attentive, would later be confirmed as an informant. Paulus wasn't living alone. The Stasi lived with him, just very quietly. Life in Dresden became a kind of managed exile. Paulus rose early, as he always had. He polished his boots, organized his desk, and wrote letters that rarely reached their intended recipients. Every envelope was opened, photographed, resealed. Phone calls were transcribed. Visitors, few and far between, were logged, timed, and analyzed. Neighbors sometimes saw him walking along the Elbe embankment, posture rigid, expression unreadable. He often walked alone, occasionally with a cane, sometimes stopping to stare at the water for long stretches, as if expecting the river to answer a question he hadn't dared ask out loud. Inside the villa, his days followed a narrow routine. A housekeeper, a cook. Occasionally, young East German officers arrived for carefully arranged visits. They treated him with a mix of reverence and discomfort, like students sitting across from a living contradiction. This was the man who had commanded the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the man who surrendered, the man who survived. Now he delivered short state-approved lectures on the dangers of fascism. His speeches appeared in modest socialist publications. His image was carefully edited: the repentant general, the enlightened convert. The regime loved him precisely because he didn't quite fit. He was proof, at least on paper, that even Hitler's field marshals could see the light. But the obedience was theatrical. Beneath it ran a current of unease that never quite disappeared. Paulus knew he was being watched. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, head tilted slightly, as if listening for a sound inside the wall. Certain rooms he avoided after dark. Some of his notes were written in abbreviations and odd phrasing that even Stasi analysts struggled to decode. Once, during a rare relaxed moment with a visitor, he reportedly smiled thinly and said, "At least the walls here don't shoot." It was dry, controlled, and telling. The uniform was gone, but the discipline remained. Paulus catalogued old maps, reread Clausewitz until the pages yellowed, drafted essays on military ethics that were never published. He looked like a man keeping himself occupied, but not at peace. Something fundamental had shifted. The blind loyalty that once tied him to Hitler was gone. In its place was clarity, sharp, uncomfortable clarity. He knew exactly what he was now: useful, watched, contained. He hadn't switched sides, he'd switched masters. The East German authorities paraded him sparingly, always on a short leash. Western journalists who requested interviews received no replies at all. A handful of Soviet reporters were approved, always with handlers present. They photographed Paulus at his desk, framed by books, the image of an enlightened man who had learned his lesson. But even in those interviews, the cracks showed. His praise for socialism was careful, rehearsed, heavy. The words landed flat. His eyes, however, betrayed something else entirely. A man tired of being a symbol, exhausted by other people's narratives. Meanwhile, the Stasi files grew thicker. They recorded everything: who visited, what he read, what he ate. One report coolly noted, "Object terrace remains secure," as if describing a military installation rather than the quiet home of a man who had already surrendered his army, his beliefs, and perhaps a piece of himself. At night, Paulus often sat in the dark by the window of his study, staring across the Elbe. He rarely turned on the lights. Neighbors claimed they sometimes saw the faint glow of a cigarette and the silhouette of a man who seemed both present and distant, physically there, mentally elsewhere. What occupied his thoughts in those hours? The soldiers he left behind at Stalingrad, the oath he broke to Hitler, the uneasy bargain he struck with the Soviets. No one knows, but rumors followed him like a shadow. Whispers of letters hidden inside walls, diaries sealed in drawers, documents contradicting the official story of his conversion. The stories circulated quietly, persistently, enough that even the Stasi began to take them seriously. When Paulus died, the response was immediate. The funeral was brief, muted, and tightly choreographed. Soviet officers oversaw the proceedings, delivering pre-approved lines about peace, learning, and redemption. There were no spontaneous moments, no risks taken. That same evening, the villa was sealed. Agents catalogued everything: furniture, photographs, papers, personal effects. Every object was logged. Every sheet of paper was evaluated. The official inventory vanished into the archives, and whatever they found, or didn't, was never disclosed. Decades later, when the Berlin Wall fell and parts of the Stasi archives opened, researchers searched for answers. They found fragments, references, half-lines that hinted at something withheld. One entry stood out. Materials withheld for state evaluation. No explanation, no follow-up, just silence. And so the legend of the villa hardened. Some believed Paulus left behind a confession, something too damaging for any side to release. Others suspected secret correspondence with Soviet generals that could have embarrassed both East and West. Whatever it was, it mattered enough to disappear completely. The aftermath of Friedrich Paulus's death. When Friedrich Paulus died, Dresden barely paused to notice. The newspapers ran short, careful notices. No dramatic headlines. His funeral followed the same script: brief, managed. A handful of military officials stood stiffly beneath a dull February sky, breath fogging the cold air. There were no salutes, no speeches worth remembering. Just a simple coffin lowered into frozen soil, watched by a small, carefully selected crowd. When it was over, people drifted away without lingering. It should have ended there. But the real story didn't begin at the graveside. It began after the mourners left. Because within hours, the Stasi arrived. First came a black government sedan, then 2 boxy trucks, then a group of plainclothes officers who moved with quiet efficiency. Official notices went up on the Iron Gate: property of the German Democratic Republic. Restricted access. Guards were posted. Questions were ignored. For the neighbors, it looked routine at first. A dead man's estate being handled by the state. In East Germany, that happened all the time. Then the nights changed. Lights flickered behind the villa's drawn curtains long after midnight. Flashlights moved from room to room. On more than one occasion, unmarked vans rolled up silently, and men carried heavy boxes out of the house without speaking. No radios, no raised voices, just the soft scrape of boots and the closing of doors. People across the street started whispering, quietly of course. Why was the Stasi still there weeks later? Why guards? Why nighttime visits? What could possibly be hidden inside the home of an aging, retired field marshal that required this level of attention? The official explanation arrived late and thin: routine property reassignment and document recovery. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it didn't fit. The operation had been classified under internal security protocol, language reserved for threats, not housekeeping. This wasn't routine. It was containment. By late spring, a specialized Stasi team arrived with orders to catalog and secure personal materials of potential state significance. It was one of those phrases designed to mean everything and nothing at once. It gave them authority to examine every drawer, every loose floorboard, every inch of wall. For days, the villa gave up nothing remarkable. Paulus's study held military books and worn maps. His bedroom contained Soviet medals, neatly folded clothes, and a typewriter. There were letters from family members, stiff and restrained. It looked exactly like the home of a man who had learned over many years how not to leave traces. Then someone noticed the wall. Behind a tall bookcase filled with military theory, a thin seam of plaster didn't quite match the rest. It was subtle, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were already looking for something that didn't belong. The officers pulled the shelf aside and found a narrow door. The handle was rusted. The keyhole is sealed with old wax. When they forced it open, the hinges complained loudly, as if protesting the disturbance. Inside was a small windowless room. Dust hung thick in the air. The smell was unmistakable. Old paper, ink, time. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes tied in faded string. Some folders were marked 1945. Others were labeled in Cyrillic. A few envelopes bore the double-headed Soviet eagle. One officer later called it a library of silence. What exactly lay inside that room has never been officially confirmed, but fragments from later internal references suggest the discovery rattled everyone involved. There were handwritten notes, drafts of speeches Paulus had never delivered. letters to family members that read nothing like the careful public statements he'd made for the state. Some documents referenced fellow officers captured at Stalingrad. Others, far more troubling, were addressed to Soviet officials. And then there was one document that changed everything. Undated, unsigned, and written unmistakably in Paulus's hand. It condemned both Hitler and Stalin, not rhetorically, not cautiously, but directly, blaming them for the destruction of Germany and the betrayal of its soldiers. It was the kind of document that couldn't exist in 1950s East Germany. Publishing it would have been unthinkable. Admitting it existed was almost as dangerous. The officers labeled it politically sensitive. Their superiors used a different phrase. The Field Marshal's problem. The files were sealed immediately, stamped top secret, and scheduled for transfer to Berlin under armed guard. The operation took 2 nights. When it was finished, the villa felt hollowed out. Shelves stood bare. The walls seemed strangely clean. Whatever had given the house weight was gone. The official inventory never surfaced. The officers who handled the materials were quietly reassigned. Within weeks, references to the Paulus file vanished from Stasi records, as if someone had gone through with an eraser rather than a pen. Of course, secrecy only sharpens curiosity. Within a year, rumors began circulating inside East German military circles. Some claimed Paulus had kept private correspondence with senior Soviet generals, letters that contradicted the approved narrative of Stalingrad. Others said he'd written detailed accounts of his interrogations, accounts that suggested he no longer believed the history he'd been forced to publicly support. A few whispers went further. They spoke of photographs, of coded lists, of evidence linking certain Soviet officers to wartime atrocities, material so dangerous that even Moscow wanted it buried. No one outside the upper ranks ever saw the documents, but the stories stuck. Decades later, when the Berlin Wall fell, historians poured into the Stasi archives hoping to finally uncover the truth. They found mountains of surveillance records, psychological profiles, and operational reports. They found almost everything, except Paulus. All that remained was a single bureaucratic reference. Personal material of exceptional state relevance. Access restricted indefinitely. No files, no letters, no confession. Just a ghost of a record hovering at the edge of history. When those boxes disappeared into Berlin's archives, a piece of the past vanished with them. But whispers continued to leak out. Fragmented, unprovable, persistent. Stories of what might have been found, of what had frightened the system enough to lock it away forever. After the funeral, the doors stayed closed. And whatever Friedrich Paulus left behind remained exactly where the state wanted it. Unseen, unspoken, and powerful precisely because of its silence. Please click the cards on the screen now for more interesting videos.